Good afternoon and welcome. My name is John Pilot. I'm the Assistant Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I want to extend a warm welcome to all of our viewers. I'm so pleased that you're joining us for our program this afternoon, Rethinking Affordable Housing, Codes, Design, and Community. We bring you today's program in partnership with UVA's School of Architecture. We received many questions in advance of the program that have been shared with our speakers. If you have a question during this presentation, you may enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please note, this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's vodcast library in a week or so. Now, I'll take a moment to introduce our faculty moderator, who will introduce the other speakers. Professor Barbara Brown Wilson is an associate professor of urban and environmental planning at the UVA School of Architecture and a co-founder of the UVA Center for Community Partnerships. Her research and teaching focus on the history, theory, ethics, and practice of planning for socio-environmental change and on the role of urban social movements in the built world. She is often change-oriented, meaning she collaborates with community partners to identify opportunities to move our communities and the field of urban planning toward just transitions and positive transformations. She is also a proud board member for the Community Climate Collaborative. Thank you for joining us. Professor Wilson, I invite you to begin our presentation today and introduce the other faculty panelists.
Thanks so much, John. Really happy to be here and happy to be amongst two of my cherished colleagues in the School of Architecture, Jeana Ripple and Schaeffer Somers. Um, I am an urban planner, but they are both architects, and I'm going to give them more formal introductions as I pass the mic to them during this time together. But I'm going to start us off um, with a few minutes to try to give a broader perspective on when we're talking about affordable housing and codes and community and trying to rethink it. What does that even mean? I thought I would do a little bit of term definition that I think applies to both the work that Professor Ripple and then Professor Somers will speak to you about as well. So I'll talk a little bit about adaptive capacity and why I think it relates to building codes, and then also talk a bit about a case that I was lucky enough to help build in Austin, Texas, before I moved here 12 years ago, called the Alley Flat Initiative. That will also give you some context for the really wonderful work that Professor Somers is doing now in Charlottesville. So, adaptive capacity is actually a term that comes from ecological thinking and has been applied to environmental thinking, engineering thinking as well. But basically, the concept is that everything is cyclical and that all kind of cycles must be constantly in motion. Stagnation, doing the same thing over and over again, is actually not the goal. And so thinking about the possibilities of reinventing and reorganizing are really a necessity. And when you're doing this in ecological thinking, it might be the absorbing the shock of a rain event or a flood event. In engineering, it might be the bouncing back of a material. But when you're talking about communities, it's actually about the stressors that they face and building choice, building many ways to live and be vibrant in what you do as the goal. So I wanted to bring that in early. This is especially important when thinking about inequities in the building world because as the extreme climate events continue to animate and change our cities, inequity becomes a key consideration because the people that are hit the hardest by extreme climate events are often the least responsible for climate change and also have the lowest capacity to finance a change after a major stressor. So really thinking about all of us are thinking about affordable housing as a part of a strategy to make all of our cities adaptive and livable. And that does mean considering inequities as a part of that work. One of my favorite reviews of, okay, so adaptive thinking, especially in the realms of the built world and climate change, was done by Linda Shee and Suzanne Moser in Science a few years ago, where they looked at cities across the US and they were like, what's the best things happening? And they really have to think at the systems level. They really work to do co-production, co-creation, thinking things through at the place-based level, so people with lived expertise have roles to play in deliberative processes. And then there is some sense of recognition for the past. So thinking about values of responsibility, ethics of care, repair, solidarity, respect for humans and non-humans. When we were talking about co-production, in my world as an urban planner, we're talking about the development of services, and this has been proven to be a better way to develop public services when you have the people that might benefit from them actually involved in the design of the service and the delivery of that service. So when you're thinking about neighborhood planning or design, that's not the way a lot of us have been technically trained to make space for, okay, what are the authentic options that people could choose from where they can bring in their local knowledge and lived expertise and then guide the process. There's a lot of ways that design involves people and communities. And so this is a survey done a few years ago as I was trying to understand the landscape of words. And so just thinking about all design as on a continuum from being about the product to being about capacities. Do you have the capacity to stay or go? Do you have the capacity to, build a vibrant food network with your neighbors, right? And then really there's always the necessity for professional expertise, but also that valuing of local knowledge is key to really good adaptive planning. In the green building certification world, which is one of the ways that affordable housing and code come together, this is a survey of green buildings value, what they're literally valuing over time. And as you see, there comes a consideration of equity and aesthetics in the last decade, but it's not done in terms of power sharing with co-creation, and it's not really done thinking about local issues. And as you'll hear from both Professors Ripple and Summer, that this is key to making plans that work for the people that live in a specific place and the stressors that they're experiencing. So I wanted to just briefly tell a story of some of the practical work that I've done in this regard in Austin, Texas. We were working with the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation, which is a community development corporation based in the east side of Austin. It is the most rapidly, or at the time, it was the most rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in the country. You can see, if you're familiar with Austin, it's just over I-35. You can see the downtown, really beautiful bungalow line streetscapes. Austin was also dealing with sprawl and the ways in which they were losing all of their biodiversity, they were losing their farmlands, and they were gaining really horrible traffic. So the affordable housing crisis has many layers to it, and a lot of people were really interested in seeing change in the built world that made sense for the local place. They also had to contend with a legacy of harm. So there was a separate but equal 1928 plan that pushed all of the people of color and all of the industry to the east side. And when this was cleaned up by environmental justice groups living on the east side in the 1990s, it became the desired development zone for a whole host of reasons. But those pressures of gentrification were partially created by this history of segregation. And so that's where the roles of recognition become really important. Um, I was actually a grad student when this all started and working alongside a design studio, and we were working with the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation, who said we have these deep lots, we want to do more with them, we want intergenerational housing, we need to make it extremely green, extremely affordable. We don't know how to make this work. It's just the code is too cumbersome. It's too hard to get this work done, even while we own these lots and are very, very savvy developers. And so we did a survey and realized, oh, by right, actually 24,000 homes, lots in Austin, Texas were technically eligible for alley flats. But then there was this overlay code that made the east side is where all of that um, green is on this map, and those alleys had been, given special infill tool acceptance, whereas a lot of the people in the parts of town that were more affluent and more resource rich in terms of transit and jobs at the time had said no, thank you. We don't want that. So there was this sense that that this type of increased affordable housing being woven into the neighborhoods was actually not a good thing in these neighborhoods, and we sought to see if we could compel the Guadalupe neighborhood to be able to do the work they wanted to do, and then also others in other parts of Austin to understand how they might work with the city to make this enriching of affordable housing possible without building high rises or other things. As you can see here, we built 2 alley flats with students and also with intergenerational families. One has a solar trellis, one is fully accessible with a very cool terracotta rain screen, and is, for the great grandmother of the people living in the front house. So really successful. But we also realized that we couldn't build these without letters from the heads of each department, because the codes, and I know you can't read this, that's almost the point. The codes were so cumbersome. They literally conflicted with one another. One architect in town, who's also a former planning commission member, said in a focus group we did, "Oh yeah, the land development code is the scar tissue of past development battles." I was like, wow, that is a really apt metaphor at this point. It's not adaptive, right? It's not meeting our values where they are. And often codes are an index of social values, but they can be an index of social values from a time gone by if you're not updating them. And Professor Ripple will talk more about that soon. Students tried to innovate around delivery systems because it's very, very expensive per square foot to build these very small secondary homes. And so thinking about, okay, if wall systems were a thing we could deploy, if we could have an East Side house farm where green jobs might be procured as well. But actually the most powerful thing that happened, and I originally poo-pooed this as a planner who's trying to be very practical, was one of our post-professional students made this amazing red rock thing in the alleyway. And Austin doesn't have red rock. It's a ridiculous image. But that's the point, is that the alleys themselves were seen as an asset. So not everyone could see the addition of affordable housing as an asset. There's a lot of research that says that increased affordable housing in your neighborhood, it does not increase crime. It does not complicate parking. Actually, most of the time it was going to add much needed parking. So these were myths that people were telling themselves because they were resistant to change. We also let people know that if you think about alleys as an asset, you could have distributed infrastructure and get rid of a power plant. You could have distributed water reclamation. You could have distributed food and biodiversity and pedestrian access. So really thinking about the provision of affordable housing as a part of coming together as neighborhoods around what we do value. And the visions got more sophisticated as the designs got more sophisticated, and we ended up actually working with the city of Austin to bring all of the different departments together. The Public Works now works with neighbors and who can say, hey, based on my community's needs. This is how I envision change happening, and that's been really exciting to watch. And the different departments just started working together to see where are the barriers to implementing our values in the built world, and how do we try to change our code and to change our processes to make that happen. And finally, I'll end with my favorite part of the story, which happened as I was moving away. Definitely not all my fault, but I got to watch it all happen, where there was codes put in place to ensure that you could have, if you were committed to deep affordability and green design, then you could have waivers, tax abatements. You could have waivers of development fees. There were really things to make sure that the development code and the policies surrounding it were paired with the actual values of the community, which is really the way that you have to do it. You cannot just sort of apply a band-aid and say like, oh, now there's a set of designs available to you, because it does increase property values, but it also increases potential displacement. So those are my introductory thoughts, just to give us some shared language. And I'm really excited to pass the baton to my colleague, Jeana Ripple. Jeana Ripple is an architect, the chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Virginia, and the Vincent and Eleanor Shea Professor of Architecture at UVA. Today, she'll be speaking about her recently published book, which is fabulous and beautiful. It's called The Type 5 City and Codifying Material Inequity in Urban America. And it's sparked ongoing research for her focused on affordable housing, durability, and spatial flexibility. Thanks, Jeana.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all for tuning in. It's nice to see some familiar names on the list, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you all, to talk to alumni today about some of the work that we're doing. As Barbara mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about this book, which uses the lens of building codes, but taps into a lot of issues of construction priorities in the United States, and of course, issues of affordable housing. So in this country, we depend on housing as long-term infrastructure. We also depend on housing as a mechanism for social mobility. Those two objectives are not always, they're not always in agreement. And this book is really about how American architecture navigated those conflicting ideals of public welfare on one side and the American dream, and how building codes of all things became the flashpoint for debate, marches on City Hall, ultimately became a mechanism to set and reinforce urban social priorities with centuries-long consequences. First, I'm going to tell you what Type 5 means. Within the title, it's pronounced 5 because these refer to Roman numerals and categories within the building codes that are designated in order to categorize materials according to combustibility. So Type 5 construction refers to the least fire-resistant category, which in the United States is typically light wood framing. And here's a fact that typically surprises people. The only thing that building codes regulate or look at when they're determining what material you're allowed to use in a given location or for a given building function is combustibility. Once you choose that material, of course, there's more regulations that come into play in terms of how you use it. But how likely is this material to burn? How quickly will it collapse when it's exposed to direct flames? This is what today shapes the character of our urban material fabric. And these were very important considerations and concerns when the codes were first created around the turn of the century. Today, they're still important, but we consider a much wider range of factors. So if we flip to the next slide, this diagram shows how current regulations, let's see, Barbara, I don't know if I can flip it. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you. So this diagram shows how on the left shows how current regulations primarily focus on one issue, whether the materials are combustible, in order to categorize these typologies of material, while architects, policymakers, industry professionals, developers are usually thinking about many other factors that are not well reflected in those rules. These might include performance, cost, construction speed, availability of local materials, workforce diversity, and the strength and growth of regional industries. So my interest in this research was to understand, first of all, as architects, we're often looking at site-specific decisions. And I was interested in understanding what are the aggregate impacts of these decisions that we make and these rules that we've put into place for about a century and a half, and how have these decisions that were focused on one singular, optimizing for one singular performance impacted other considerations over time. This is what I found, at least in the 5 case study cities that are discussed in this book: strikingly different material patterns across American cities, and really the result of different incremental rules applied across different cultural priorities, using different resources, responding to different geographies over time. So I call these maps each city's material fingerprint. The darker dots show areas with dense wood frame construction. The lighter areas mark the places built with sturdier, non-combustible materials. And each city's pattern is distinct, and each chapter in the book traces that history and looks at why they turned out this way. And I'll give you a little preview of some of those differences and some of the impacts of them. But there's one really important broader distinction here to mention, which is that this kind of widespread acceptance of wood, specifically light wood frame construction in cities, is uniquely American. It's in most other developed countries, building with this much wood in dense urban areas isn't permitted or isn't culturally acceptable. In the US, it's become a defining feature of our urban fabric. But this wasn't inevitable. It was, in fact, fiercely debated during the settlement of the country and as cities were growing. So I'm going to start by reading you 2 quotes that I think capture that historic tension and debate and the trade-offs that we should still be considering today. So the first is by Thomas Jefferson, arguing in his notes on Virginia that wood construction threatened public welfare. And he said, "A country whose buildings are of wood can never increase its improvements to any considerable degree." He goes, their duration is highly estimated at 50 years. And he goes on to say, whereas when buildings are of durable materials, every new edifice is an actual and permanent acquisition to the state, adding to its value as well as to its ornament. That was in 1785. A century later, an American pattern book author argued the opposite, essentially that wood construction was essential to building the American dream. And he said, "Wood construction suits the unstable and migratory character of our people. While wood is abundant and comparatively cheap, it will necessarily continue to be employed by those who must build cheaply or not at all. Rent paying is distasteful to our people, who choose rather to live in houses of low cost owned by themselves. We're proud of the flimsy, unsubstantial structures so sneered at by foreigners, which dot the whole face of this country. They are the homes of the people who will by and by build and own better ones." So this conflict of these 2 conflicting viewpoints came to a head after the Great Chicago Fire. A fast, low-cost method of wood construction called balloon framing created continuous wall cavities that acted like 1,000 small chimneys throughout the city. And the disaster, the magnitude of that fire, made clear the need to stop building that way, to cap those vertical openings at every floor. In the aftermath, the issue and the debate extended far beyond technical fixes. I think when I learned about this in my architectural studies, it was a simplified narrative that Chicago burned, we made building codes to fix it, and we moved on with new technologies. In fact, this was a huge public debate that even reshaped the local politics at the time. In the mayoral election just a month later, 2 factions split into the fireproofers and the non-fireproofers parties. Thousands of workers marched on City Hall, and this was a social conflict for them. They argued that were the city to ban wood frame construction completely, it would strip them of their land value because they would no longer be able to rebuild. So in the end, when the city did define new fire limits, it compromised. It did not fully ban wood frame construction. And this compromise, the book argues, really set off a series of compromises throughout American cities. Chicago chose to protect the business district, which on the left is outlined with a dotted line, but not the entire burn area, which is shown in dark gray, or the full population, dense population, which is in the light gray, or the city limits, which is the outline of that left-hand diagram. This was seen as temporary. There was acknowledgement of the risks, there was acknowledgement of the trade-off at that time, and officials assumed, and they published articles in the newspaper saying that a safer, more durable buildings will gradually replace these wood frame buildings as people can afford to build them. However, fast forward 150 years, and the image that you see on the right shows that same dotted line from 1872 with contemporary wood frame construction shown in black. In other words, Chicago has expanded, but the areas that were initially allowed to be built out of wood are still primarily wood frame construction in the contemporary city. That compromise didn't fade over time. It produced long-lasting effects that have impacts today far beyond fire safety. As discussed earlier in the notes on Virginia and the pattern books, wood frame buildings were not necessarily designed to last, and they weren't even thinking of them as intended to last at the time. So what we see today is that in Chicago, clusters of buildings that need more frequent upkeep align with areas of economic vulnerability and disinvestment. In this image, wood frame housing appears in yellow, and higher foreclosure rates show up in the darker pink areas. And there is a correlation between the two. If we zoom into neighborhoods with more significant economic challenges, a more severe pattern emerges. So abandonment, in this case, the red hatches show abandonment. Abandonment tracks building material more closely than any other social vulnerability measure. And this surprised me. Material type in these neighborhoods are a stronger predictor of abandoned properties than poverty, unemployment, education level, dependency rates, disability demographics, household crowding, or really any other CDC-defined social vulnerability. So our current idea, part of the takeaway, I hope, from this study is that our current idea of affordability leaves out other important social factors. Durability and economic vulnerability is one of them, but each chapter goes through another factor and how it played out in the history of the development of those cities. For example, in New York, Type 5 construction, which is also one of the most moisture-absorbing building types, is often concentrated in flood-prone areas. These buildings made up an overwhelming share of the damage during Hurricane Sandy, and they're linked to higher rates of health problems in flood zones, including mold exposure and elevated blood lead levels. And so here you can kind of see some of that flood zone and in the yellow where the wood frame is located, overlapping with that flood zone. In Tampa, building material regulation became closely linked to social cohesion. So in other words, the way that we choose to build and regulate what can happen in those buildings is going to determine how many and what kind of gathering spaces are allowed. And this was a very important thing for certain neighborhoods in Tampa and for the ability for residents to easily start new businesses. Evolving material codes were also used in Tampa as a tool to justify slum clearance during urban renewal in the late 1950s and early 60s. So not only is it a regulation that defines how a neighborhood operates, it also defines over time it can become an issue to place vulnerable populations in a more vulnerable construction typology. In Philadelphia, strict material regulations and discriminatory union demographics sparked a national wave of protests, and this chapter really aims to reframe affordability not only as a matter of low upfront cost, but also a matter of aligning jobs and housing. Soon after some of these protests in Philadelphia and other cities, an architect named Max Bond argued that material choice for architects should be understood as an ethical decision. one that affects labor opportunities in local communities, not only one that is about cost and structure and fire and all of those other things that we are thinking about. And finally, in Seattle, Seattle and the Northwest in general, they innovated in terms of building codes. They began allowing more stories, a taller stack of wood frame construction, and this was viewed as a win for affordability. However, it also reduces spatial flexibility because it requires more frequent structural spans, and another potential durability problem. But this taller wood frame construction, often called 5/1, was recently adopted in our national codes. So there's one concern that arises in terms of the detailing of these buildings. Stacking this many floors in wood means either the building will shift over time, expand and contract over the seasons by potentially up to several inches, or builders recommend an innovative system called modified balloon framing. You might remember me mentioning balloon framing as the innovation in Chicago that created thousands of little chimneys in the Great Fire. So this is a risky trade-off. It can be a safe solution if it's detailed and built very carefully and more expensively. If it's done poorly, it can be unsafe, or it can allow considerable movement and maintenance issues over time. And this is a detail that becomes hidden in the walls upon the completion of any of these projects. So, either way, this is a factor that we should be considering if this is seen as a solution for affordability. When we consider housing abundance today and the housing needs we have in this housing crisis, in addition to more quantity and lower cost, I'm advocating in this book to consider our history, our track record, that these decisions also impact long-term durability, building lifespan, job access, labor demographics, resource consumption, occupancy opportunity, social cohesion, health, climate resilience. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And to reiterate some of Barbara's message, it's very helpful when we're talking about these regulations and our goals to be mindful of other community priorities that may be different in different places and may affect not only the risks we want to control, but what we want to incentivize as we're building. Now I will I will add one more note on a maybe more hopeful note, which is, what are we doing about it at UVA? In addition to some of my colleagues' research, I'm embarking on a collaboration with some colleagues across grounds, spanning engineering, economics, law, public health, and working with affordable housing developer partners in Northern Virginia. We are working on how to deliver not just low-cost housing, but housing that's durable, long-lasting, and climate resilient. And we're trying to understand in as much detail as we can the policies and economic tools to support it. And my colleagues will now talk more about how proofs of concept and local partnerships are also key to making these ideas work in practice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeana. I am excited to pass the baton once more to Professor Schaeffer Somers, who is also a registered architect and an assistant professor of architecture and public health sciences at the University of Virginia. Schaeffer's early career work is in aerospace engineering. So, when someone says like, well, he's not a rocket scientist, he actually is. And his teaching and research bridge systems thinking, health impact assessment, and community engaged design. He recently started a funded research lab called the Housing Futures Lab, which will co-produce small footprint housing strategies with community partners in Charlottesville. And he'll speak about that today. Thanks, Schaeffer.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, so I want to give you a brief introduction to the work we're doing here in Charlottesville through the lab. Our initial funding comes from the LS3P Foundation, which supports research across 4 strategic pillars: healthy communities, social equity, sustainable systems, and economic mobility. The title of our funded project through the foundation is Open Source Affordable Housing, Designs for Charlottesville. And I'll show you how the work touches on all four of these four pillars. We are not working alone. The lab is partnering with the City of Charlottesville's Department of Neighborhood Development Services and the UVA Center for Cultural Landscapes, directed by Dr. Andrea Roberts. Dr. Roberts' team leads our community-based research, and her approach shapes our methodology. We're trying not to design for communities, but we're designing with them. So the goal is to create permit-ready housing prototypes through a genuine co-production process with Charlottesville residents, paired with a policy framework that reduces barriers to home ownership and promotes health equity. It's simple to sort of state that, but it's a substantial project to take on. To understand why this work matters now, you need to look at a little more context about the Charlottesville Development Code. This is a landmark reform in the city's zoning ordinance and the product of a 5-year state-mandated comprehensive planning process. It represents a fundamental rethinking of how we govern land use in the city. The previous ordinance was organized around the familiar designations you'll find in most American cities, like R1 districts, shown here in yellow. These are restricted to single-family homes here in Charlottesville. The map has shaped land use here in the city through different iterations for nearly a century. This is actually the first zoning map in Charlottesville, drawn in April 1929, so not long after the Austin map that Barbara showed earlier. This created the A-designated residential districts separated out from business and industrial uses. It looks very technical. It looks very neutral. And the areas that are kind of defined in yellow are the single family housing districts. So it looks technical, it looks neutral, but it wasn't. The map was drawn directly on top of a racial map of the city, produced at a time when UVA was the National Center for Eugenics Research and Advocacy. That research underpinned state-level legislation permitting compulsory sterilization and banning interracial marriage. So these early land use codes were actually instruments of exclusion. In Charlottesville, that history is not distant. It's actually deeply embedded in the built fabric of the city, and has produced health disparities between different communities and neighborhoods. So the new development code makes a decisive break from this legacy. It no longer recognizes single-family dwellings as a protected category. Instead, it allows up to 3 dwelling units per lot by right, and up to 6 dwelling units if 3 of those units are designated for affordable housing at a defined percentage of area median income, or AMI. So that's a genuine structural change. You've probably heard the term missing middle housing. The new code creates the opportunity to develop this typology of modest, individual, and multi-unit structures that sit between single-family homes and larger apartment buildings in what planners might call gentle density, adding homes to neighborhoods without fundamentally transforming their character. One of the most widely used tools for adding density in areas designated for single-family housing is the accessory dwelling unit, a small self-contained residence sharing a residential lot with a larger primary home. Santa Cruz in Silicon Valley pioneered this approach nearly 20 years ago, producing pre-approved design sets for new construction and the conversion of garages into dwelling units. Many cities have followed this example, and while ADUs are not defined in the new development code in Charlottesville, the principle of making it easier to add a second or a third unit is very much at the heart of the new rules. Rather than producing a pattern book of designs for Charlottesville communities, we want to develop prototypes with them. So our process starts with a simple but essential question: what are the hopes and dreams of your community? We want our designs to be genuinely responsive, not to what designers and planners assume people want, but to what residents themselves envision for their neighborhoods. One of the courses that I teach is health impact assessment, and public health students are building tools to map the potential health pathways and causal connections in the outcomes of this work. That includes mitigating risks, particularly the risk that adding density might accelerate gentrification and displace residents who are already housing insecure. So good intentions are not good enough. We need to predict and monitor the outcomes of this program and similar projects. As we learn from communities, we explore what's technically achievable within the new code. One question is how to make the code legible to ordinary homeowners, not just planners and architects. New York City just recently launched a program called ADU for You, and students in my seminar developed test cases for how this type of initiative might be translated to Charlottesville. So this image shows where a parcel owned by an owner can see and read different important data and parameters for their parcel, including square footages, setbacks, and sort of see the rules that they'd have to reflect on as they think about developing their property. And so these diagrams are our early experiments in making the development code and its impact in this way more visible, turning abstract regulatory language into something a homeowner or a community member can actually understand and use to explore their options. Corner lots and houses located on alleyways are more readily adaptable for multiple housing units. And this shows other sort of situations that homeowners and land developers might encounter. The new code also enables something called a pocket neighborhood or a cottage court, small clusters of homes oriented around shared courtyards or common green space. And this raises a question I find genuinely exciting. Could this typology support intergenerational living and a real sense of collective commons the way similar communities in Denmark you might see in places like Copenhagen? Also, can houses be small enough to be affordable in the expensive real estate market while still meeting our physical, social, and emotional needs? The community land trust model is one compelling answer. It creates a real pathway from starter home to a home for a growing family, and then finally to age in place, preserving our social capital and building household wealth over time. We're creating a framework for affordability that begins with designing homes with lower first cost and lower long-term maintenance and operating costs. So it's not just cheaper to buy, but also cheaper to own and operate over time. This is a design that students produced in my seminar this spring that utilizes prefabrication to reduce the initial cost of the home through factory-built patterns, factory-built panels, and interior wall panels that reduce the installation costs of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems on site. This student group designed a modular home that generates different size houses and additions using an insulated structural panel system. They also developed an interesting analytical model for optimizing structures for daylight and energy. And this fall in my research studio, students will develop a kit of parts, a set of components that can be assembled in flexible configurations, shaped by what we learn alongside community members. And I'm calling this a living kit. Think of it as a design as creative play. The same pieces can generate many possible homes in different social environments. Landscape is an integral part of the system. One of the most compelling dimensions is developing a typology of landscape strategies that individual homeowners can use to manage stormwater, expand urban canopy, and offset the environmental impacts of densification. This work builds on the work of Julia McNally, who graduated last year with a Master of Landscape Architecture degree. In parallel, I'm collaborating with Professor Mo Ismail's Open Structures Lab and the UVA sawmilling program to explore low carbon timber systems. So mechanically laminated panels, a type 4 construction to refer to the typology that Jeana introduced, that could support regional economic development while reducing the carbon footprint of new housing, utilizing urban tree stock. Finally, the UVA School of Architecture has a long tradition of working with communities to design and build housing in local neighborhoods with student labor and design. From John Qualley's Solar Decathlon and Ecomod houses to Anselmo Canfora's Initiative Recover, design build produces powerful learning outcomes for students and can be a genuine catalyst for community change. So that's a quick overview of where we are and where we're headed with this research lab. And I look forward to the conversation with Barbara, Jeana, and with all of you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to all of the great questions that were submitted by our community of participants beforehand. We're going to start with a few of those, and then I can see that there's some really exciting questions in the chat as well. And we've got about a little less than 15 minutes for this conversation. So we'll when we can, we'll try to answer multiple questions at the same time. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to start with a question that I'll start answering, and then I think your answers will actually be more interesting to this question that came in ahead of time, which is what makes a housing unit truly affordable, and how are affordable housing projects typically funded. Just feels like we gotta definitely cover that one as a part of this. So in the United States, housing should not be technically considered, and I know Professor Ripple is going to give a much more interesting and full answer, but by the housing and urban development part of the government, they want you to not have to pay more than 30% of your income, no matter what that is, on your housing. And so any person or household, importantly, that is paying more than 30% of their income, that is inaffordable. You have a housing burden that makes it hard for you to meet all the other daily life requirements of your household. And area median income helps decide what affordability is. In our region, it's especially challenging because we have such a wide range of household incomes, and the wealth disparities do, as Professor Somers mentioned, do really overlap with that history of structural racism that we've experienced. So I see there's a part of that question about Charlottesville specifically, and this is the thing that happens all over the country, but certainly considering both wealth and household income as a part of what makes for affordable housing is important. And I will say that typically affordable housing projects in the United States are funded through mechanisms like the low-income housing tax credit, which can be both private and nonprofit. Often many groups come together to apply for these credits. The state mandates what counts to give you points to then get those credits, and only a few are allotted every year in each region. So they're quite competitive. And then there's a tax credit that pays for a fair amount of the subsidy, but you still have to bring in many, many other sources. So local subsidy, state subsidy, and then often foundations as well. Jeana, can I hand you the mic to
Sure, thank you. This is a great question because it allows us to kind of cover some big picture territory. I think the piece that I would add to Barbara's excellent explanation is that affordability needs to be thought of over time, that it's not just an upfront issue of low cost. It's also a matter of how will these buildings, homes continue to be viable and continue to serve needs in 50 or more years? And maybe those needs will change. And how do we anticipate that? One of the things that we're thinking about in terms of how do we incentivize higher quality construction, how do we incentivize some of the things we know are important without increasing costs, which was another form of this question that we received, is that we have to look at multiple objectives at the same time. We can't only look at lowering upfront costs and building more housing. This was historically the problem that many cities ran into in the development of their cities to begin with. For example, in New York, they were really facing a water crisis in many ways, and a health crisis in terms of dealing with water. But they regulated that and thought of that completely separate from housing, and that until the 1980s, and that led to the current crisis of flooding and health and housing in New York. So, for example, how can we look at carbon sequestration goals that the state has at the same time that we're looking at affordability goals? Does that give us more levers to pull? How can we look at job creation and economic development at the same time that we're looking at housing? And does that allow us to pool more resources that can have more shared benefits across our communities?
Thanks so
Land
much.
trust. I would say the community land trust model is another way to kind of think about how you can create a kind of ecosystem of different size houses. So you like the small house may not work for everyone, but as you grow and your needs grow, then you can move within the land trust into different size units. And that creates a kind of stable and durable model for affordability as well.
Absolutely. And I was gonna sort of bring in, there's a question about why do they all have to be that tiny? And absolutely not. Um I'm gonna pass a question to Schaeffer to answer that will give more background on why this issue is so cumbersome to deal with in the code typically. That makes it an interesting challenge to add infill, but the thing that makes accessory dwelling units, alley flats, however you want to describe them, compelling is you don't have to change the sort of fabric of a local neighborhood, and you don't have to build something very, very large in order to make it happen, which is typically a way that very few can get involved, right? So those tax credit projects are very, very large. And only so many are one. Whereas affordable housing done in an infill way allows for you to preserve neighborhood fabric and also for other people to participate in meeting that challenge head on. But you do need to think about policy change as well. So, Schaeffer, what are major federal, state, and local regulations that most significantly delay or prevent the construction of affordable housing?
Well, just to kind of continue what I was speaking to earlier, at the local level, single family zoning is definitely something that has a major impact. So setting minimum lot sizes, parking requirements. The Charlottesville Development Code actually doesn't require parking for the RA, the new residential zoning district. So that's really impactful. Whether or not the market would support a house in a particular neighborhood without parking is definitely something that is like case by case basis. So permitting is also something that can stall projects even if the code's developed. So utility access is going to be something that the research lab is going to be working with the city to try to understand, like as you create new sublots for new dwelling units, be able to sort of create connections to city utilities will become an issue that can delay and prevent affordable housing using that mechanism. At the state level, states have the ability or the agency to allow or disallow this type of missing middle housing type. In Virginia, significantly just passed a piece of legislation to allow for state, any county or city in the state, you by right can now do ADUs. And they've capped permitting fees to kind of prevent sort of measures to try to prevent that from being implemented. And there's actually a really significant piece of legislation now awaiting a president's signature called the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, and actually kind of builds in incentives and grant programs for pattern books and pre-approved ADU designs. You can kind of look up this piece of legislation that was passed by both houses, but that's an example of where the federal government has gotten actively involved in trying to promote innovation in the housing space.
Great. There's a few questions related in the chat to both specifically the Austin ADU resolution on restrictions on affordability, and also infill development using house plans, where you get lower permit fees. And so I wanted to start by answering the Austin version of the question, and then pass it along to Schaeffer to add in any way that he wants. So in Austin, just that the code that I shared, that policy change from 2020, if you committed to deeply long-term, not just 5 years, but deeply long-term affordability, you were eligible for low interest loans, and as long as you were related to income eligibility. So low wealth households would be able to participate because of this ability to have low interest and potentially forgivable loans. You were eligible to participate in the use of pre-approved plans that did make the process streamlined in terms of permitting. There was tax abatements and grants for property owners who constructed an income restricted ADU to offset that increase in property values, that can, make it a tool of displacement and gentrification. And then they were working with the county there, which is the taxing entity, to explore potential minimization of property taxes in general for those who construct alley flats. And they also would work with low and moderate income homeowners and renters to develop criteria and priorities for future designs to make sure that they really did meet these livability standards. All of these had been co-produced in the first place, but and there was also a sort of plan in place there, just as Schaeffer mentioned, to allot a partnership with the land trust. We're really lucky that many places now in the United States have that type of feature, Charlottesville being one, but many places in the country have utilized it, not only for small units, but actually for all types of density, where you really take the extremely high and constantly rising land values out of the discussion and allow people to build some equity, but in a small kind of a way that also allows them to participate in home ownership. But Schaeffer, I'll pass you the mic.
I don't have a lot to add to that, and actually I have a lot to learn from you, so it's going to be great working with you and your experience in Austin. I think just speaking to the Charlottesville Development Code, this idea that you can have you have a single family house and you can have up to 6 units on a parcel if you can meet the sort of coverage and setback limits, that opens up the possibility that you might have 3 units that are kind of intended to kind of generate a profit for the homeowner as developer, but that 3 units might actually be designated for affordability. And can we create partnerships with the community land trust that's active here in Charlottesville, whereby those units can start to get folded into that ecosystem, I think, and that it kind of contributes to a kind of gentle density, that this doesn't become something that generates a lot of neighborhood pushback, that actually it's being seen as like completing neighborhoods and making them richer places to live.
Great, thanks so much. And Jeana, do you want to talk about increased density as your last question? I want to give you the last question. Does that make you happy?
Sure. Well, maybe
Okay.
maybe there's 2 questions that I could try to address.
Combine a
that we
few.
received beforehand. One was about, are there examples, and Schaeffer and Barbara have mentioned some, are there examples of places that are doing this well? And then what are the trade-offs to think about with density? How do we make density more acceptable? I think, one thing to think about in terms of density is that as we increase density, we change building typologies by code, and also by structural necessity. And so we have to be thoughtful about how we're doing that, how we're looking at those changes, not only in terms of increasing the unit size on a lot, but and the unit count, but also what that means in terms of the actual building fabric we're investing in our communities. What might that allow or not allow in terms of people who might want to run a business on that site, and what scale would that have to be to work for them? There's a lot of those competing factors that we could think about more carefully when we talk about density. In terms of good examples, one of the exciting conversations that's beginning to get more traction is this idea of building for a loose fit. That one of the ways that we can think about long-term adaptive capacity in our building fabric is that we're not only designing and building for one type of use forever, and that it's thinking about adaptive reuse at the front end, that we're not only trying to adapt old buildings for new uses, we're trying to build in ways that can accommodate future adaptation. And so that requires different kinds of thinking by our policymakers, by our designers, by our communities. But there are some cities globally that are starting to incentivize that kind of approach.
As we come to the top of the hour today, I just wanted to thank our faculty speakers so much for sharing these insights about design solutions and affordable housing. It has been truly fascinating to hear about these innovations, both around the country and locally. I know that our audience has learned a lot from your expertise, and I have as well, so thank you. To discover more Lifetime Learning content, please visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Join us on May 28th to learn how luxury hotels reinvent themselves to stay on top as cultural values change in Once Elite, Always Elite: How Prestige Survives in a Changing World. Thank you once again, esteemed faculty, and thank you, audience. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.